Hello, and welcome to episode 91 of the PowerScore LSAT podcast. This is John Dinnick in Los Angeles.
And this is Dave Kaloran in Napa Valley.
Yes, it is. How you doing, man?
I'm doing outstandingly well.
Wow.
Yourself?
I'm okay. I'm a mixed ball of emotions. My little sister's about to have a baby, and one of my favorite comedians died this morning. So I'm a mess. We'll see if I
Better
can.
than the reverse happening. So I'll give
One of my favorite comedians having a baby and my sister dying. I suppose it is.
The thing I like about you is your black humor that you're able to indulge in so quickly and readily.
Yeah.
But congratulations, in advance to your sister and her husband.
Yeah, Nashville's about to gain one, and I become Funkle times 2. That's fun uncle abbreviated, apparently.
You're good with kids, so I don't think most people would expect that, but it is in fact true.
I'm good with kids after a certain age. There's a threshold where they stop just being like sticky, loud furniture and they become a person. And then I can actually, I can engage. I don't really care about this one for 3 more years.
You got time to grow into it then, Uncle.
Yeah, well, so does she. It is a she, by the way. This is 2 little girls. They've been blessed with,
100% support there. As the father of a daughter, I'm all about it. I think it's fantastic.
I agree with you. I feel like this one's going to be a drummer. So I've already got the kit picked out. They're going to love me come Christmas.
You're getting the band going. Yeah, I like it.
That's right. The karaoke machine for the oldest. Drum kit for this new one. Speaking of bad decisions, what are you drinking?
I am drinking something that reflects my fatigue after the long weekend.
Yeah.
This is a classic tiki bar drink. Very excited to have not just this one, but the several more I intend to have after this is over. This is a zombie.
Elaborate.
And the reason it's called a zombie is because there's so much alcohol in it that you have too many of these, you turn into a zombie.
Okay.
It's 3 different types of rum. There's light rum, gold rum, and dark rum, which really, there's just a matter of aging and so forth. So that's 3 ounces right there. And then there's a bunch of juices and essentially sweeteners. So like pineapple juice, lemon juice, lime juice. There's some like simple syrup in there. So it's kind of got a nice yellowy, orangey color, and it certainly packs a punch, but it all works together because I think of the rum and the juice together as just such a classic beach drink.
Color me impressed. That's some serious business you've got going on. And I hope you do have more. I hope you actually live up to the drink's name.
You might have to pick me up off the floor later.
Yeah, I'll fly up just to drag you out of the deep end.
Nice. So what are you drinking?
Well, in tribute to you, I'm actually having a glass of your wine. Finn's Post wine. This is a Cabernet from 2017 that your wife was kind enough to send to me with a discount. I paid for it, but she didn't charge me full price. Don't hold that against her. I know you're going to get upset.
Oh, I'm going to. There's big trouble in our house tonight now that I heard you got a discount. You pay full price.
Oh, it's separate bets tonight.
Well, I hope you enjoy it. It's a fine St. Helena wine. I'm a huge advocate of the St. Helena appellation that comes from. I think it's been underrated over the years, and it is better than some of the more famous regions around here.
I frequently recommend it to people. I'll take the opportunity to do so again here. It is delicious and not as smoky as you might expect.
Shouldn't be too smoky at all.
Given its origin.
It's 27. That was harvested before all the fire and smoke got to some people. So that was already on its way out of the valley at that point into barrel. So we shouldn't have no problem with that.
I'm enjoying it tremendously. So thank you.
You are welcome.
Let's move on. Yeah, I was going to say you chose a song again for the week. I think you've just basically become our Casey Kasem. What did you pick?
I went way back, 50 plus years back, to an absolute classic that I think is one of those songs that, first off, the band is The Temptations. And I think a lot of people are like, oh, yeah, they were a great band a long time ago. But the song is Ball of Confusion. And if you go back and listen to it, it's really prescient and quite current. It's actually a really hip song.
I like the song
in a lot of respects. I've been listening to some bands from the 60s and 70s, and this song is from 1970. Recently, not 100% because I can't take too much of that era at once, but like maybe 20, 30, 40 minutes a day.
Sure.
And I've discovered these bands that I never listened to, like Paul Revere and the Raiders, who have these songs that are really cool, that I'm just not overly familiar with. Yeah, I know Led Zeppelin and the Beatles and all these bands, but some of the stuff that was a little bit less popular is actually, I think, cool in a very direct way.
The Temptations in many ways were groundbreaking, and I think most people just see them as this kind of classic tops, almost like a wedding soundtrack type of band. But they really pushed the envelope in a lot of ways.
Classic Motown is, the way a lot of people would think about it, and certainly they were, and they have a lot of those traits, but the lyrics on this song and what they're talking about, very current, I would say, to today. If someone said this song was just put out today and it's kind of like a retro feel to it, I'd be like, wouldn't be all that surprised. So
yeah.
Get a chance, listen to it. Ball of Confusion, though, relates to our topic of the day and what we saw over the past week, because we're going to talk about the August 2021 LSAT.
Yes, we are.
Some people were more confused.
Ball of Confusion may represent more of our expectations than the reality that manifested, happily.
I know you and I were quite worried about this test.
Yeah.
We're going to dive right into it and not even talk about the LSAT world, because literally this is the LSAT world for us. But I know you and I had a lot of anticipation and uncertainty beforehand as to whether or not we'd be able to have control of this test with the added experimental section, and whether or not we'd even be able to track it. And I know through Saturday and Sunday, even though I got distracted with a few things and had to step away, we felt pretty good about things. And so by the time we got to the end of Sunday, I was like, I wish I could just do the podcast right now and talk about what happened on the weekend, because I think you and I felt very little confusion, but online I could see massive confusion that was ongoing at that point. And I really wanted to clear it up, but we've kind of agreed to wait until the podcast at the end of the week to be able to do this, so that everybody who is taking the test is primarily through their experience at that point, and it doesn't affect outcomes at all.
Yeah, you and I had that conversation at the end of Saturday and Sunday. In fact, we were like, man, I wish we could record right now. But of course, we're mindful of the fact that it's an ongoing experience for people. We don't want to prejudice anything, so...
Yeah, and especially when you realize that on Tuesday, the sections being used were essentially all the weekend sections. And if we'd done that and released it on, say, Monday, people would have been listening to what we had to say about it, identifying topics and what have you, and that would not have been fair to the weekend people, and it would have given the Tuesday people an unfair advantage. So that's one of the reasons that we wait.
Yeah.
And hopefully this is coming out on Thursday afternoon. Late, so that at this point, everybody who's taken the test is either done or they're in the testing room. And if not, they're about to walk in 5 minutes. They're not going to get any advantage.
Yeah, I don't think we're spoiling anything at this point, despite our potential desire to a few days ago. Let's talk about some of the details of this test, because I think it's interesting to begin with the numbers themselves.
Yeah, and there is that thing where you know something and other people don't.
Oh, God, I'm bad at keeping secrets.
You really want to keep on it. Okay. So let's talk about the August 2021 LSAT. And we know that it is now largely in the books. So the first thing that is most important, I think, to everybody is the score release is coming up on Friday, September 10th, a little bit longer of a horizon than we have been seeing for most of these exams. But you've got to wait until September 10th before you're going to see the results.
Yeah, I suppose we should address one of the common questions that we get at this point, which is, any chance they come early?
Maybe
I'm making the same. I can't see your
Yeah.
face, but the noises tell me your face. I'm making the same face.
Yeah, they haven't. They largely for a long time kept to it, and then recently, here it's a day early, which drove me nuts because I'm like, don't start that again.
Yeah.
And I think there were reasons for that. They wanted to give people time, an additional day to register for the following test. We're not going to have that conflict here.
That's right.
The registration and the score release date don't match up very well, and I don't think they can move the score release up early enough to get it out in front of the registration for the following exam. So
yeah, I don't think so either. So yeah, I expect Friday morning at 9 a.m. on the 10th.
I would say that you are not going to see any early test release here.
Right.
So let's go through what we saw on Saturday, Sunday, Tuesday, and so forth in terms of the number of test takers. First thing, Saturday was a little bit smaller than Sunday. There was about 7,500 people who took the test. Anybody who follows me on Twitter saw me tweeting out the numbers and the progress of how many people had started the test, how many people had finished the test throughout the day. On Sunday, you had a bigger day. It was 8,500 or so, and these are rough numbers. And then on Monday, we all rested, although you and I frantically collated.
Yeah. No rest
and confirmed and conferred with each other over exactly what had happened. And then on Tuesday, I think you ended up around 8,400. And then on Thursday, we'll have about 250 paper and pencil test takers. You add that all up, and you're a little bit over 24,000 or so people who ultimately took this test. So that's a pretty sizable group that's out there. The nice thing is that you can see the volumes relatively even throughout the days. And I would say that overall, one of the things that's been happiest to me is that the number of complaints, like the percentage of complaints as compared to the people taking this test, has been way down.
Yeah, I saw that too.
So...
Yeah. It seemed to be a pretty smooth administration. Part of that, I imagine, stems from the fact that people were evenly distributed for the most part over the various days. I think if we'd had a day with 1,000 people and another day with, say, 14,000 people, we might have had some issues, but this was as intended.
Yeah, they don't let that happen, and for good reason. I also think this is a zone of where people are becoming used to it and more comfortable with it. And that goes not just for test takers, but for the people at LSAC, as well as, to some extent, ProctorU. There were a lot more problems early on. Are there still problems? Yes. There are always going to be some problems. And so if you really had a catastrophic issue, there will be a retake of the test. You'll get something different. That is coming up on August 26th, so Thursday, a week from now. That's the new standard of what they do. So there will be retaking possibilities. And I saw, the usual posts and got messages from people about, like, this is what happened. What do I do? Remember, if you have a problem with the test itself, you want to go to your account on the lsac.org site, sign in, and use the test complaint form there, and kind of describe what happened, why it's a problem, and so on. They watch that queue like a hawk, as I've been told, and that is the fastest way to get action. It does take a little bit of time, but usually, especially on the weekend, you're looking at almost 2 weeks' time to kind of like see whether or not you're going to have that retake.
Yeah, and thank goodness for that, frankly, because people do have issues, and this is the safety net for those folks. This is great. Let's talk about the other associated thing that sometimes gets overlooked despite our best efforts, Dave, which is LSAT writing. LSAT writing, man. A part of me hates to keep talking about this, but the larger part of me knows we need to.
Just really a reminder, now that the testing is primarily done, if you haven't done the LSAT writing, go do it. If you took it right now, 10 minutes after hearing this, you would still get your test scored. Yes. And it would come out. And again, this is assuming that you don't have an LSAT writing on record. If you do, you are in the clear and you don't have to worry about it. But if you're just taking the LSAT writing for the first time, you must have one in the books in order to get your score released to you. So you are looking at a window that is closing soon. You can't wait another week and be like, oh, I'll just do it now and they'll get my score. There's a certain point where it's like, all right, now they just don't have enough time to process it and get it done. So I would say you've got several more days for sure, but why push it? Do it earlier as opposed to later.
That's right. Yeah, don't wait till September to do this. You wait till September to get your score, but the rest of this needs to be taken care of. We have got some blog posts that essentially outline exactly how to do the LSAT writing. We'll link those in the description here. If you're unsure of how to go about this or the best way to construct your essay, those will walk you through it start to finish, so you're covered.
Yeah, there are very clear rules that you need to follow, things like not having a smartwatch on and so forth that you do not want to violate, because if you do, they throw out your writing sample, your LSAT writing, and force you to start again, and nobody wants to do two of those things.
That's correct. Yeah, it's an extra 30 minutes of your life you didn't need to spend. So get it right the first time, but we've got instructions on how to do so.
We mentioned the October LSAT before. What's the deadline for that test in terms of how it relates to the score release here?
Well, we'll see if people can hear the bummer in my voice that doesn't relate to the other things I started this conversation with, that you're going to have to wait for your scores from this test before you could, ultimately before you could sign up for October. The deadline for October is August 25th. So there's about a 2-week gap between when you have to make a decision for October and when you'll actually know your results from August. And again, that's kind of a shame. I know a lot of people are disappointed by that.
Yeah, I think this is turning out to be that way because of just the way the calendar works. So that means that if you're listening to this shortly after it comes out, you have about a week to make the decision on October. You will not have your September or your August score,
Right? I know.
In hand. There's so many different months right here that are floating around. Yeah, you're not going to have your August results in hand before you have to make a decision on October, and I don't see that changing at all. So as I got a bunch of messages saying, please, use your influence with LSAC to make it happen. I'm like, some things I think I can influence. This is not one of them.
Yeah, if we get real lucky, we might see scores on like September 8th, but not August 25th, which is when the deadline for October is. So this is just, unfortunately, one of those decisions you have to make a little bit empty-handed.
Yeah, I think when the difference between those two dates is like a day or two or maybe even 3, then there's a good chance that they're going to try to manipulate it so that they can get scores out before the deadline hits. This is over 2 weeks differential. There's no way that gap's going to be overcome. There will literally be people still testing after August 25th. And so there is zero chance that they are going to get scores out prior to August 25th. So I think that's something we can just go ahead and accept and move on from.
Yeah, well, let's move on then. What did we see as far as the administration went? Because we always try to keep tabs on how things go with the ProctorU and the back end logistically.
It's funny because I feel like this has fallen into the category of the usual recently. I didn't see anything that was abnormal from what we typically see. And there's always some issues. There's always a scenario where, they want you to, not have doors or windows behind you in certain angles. And they want you to move your desk for that. There's always some proctor who forgets that earplugs are okay, or a student will ask about using Control F and be told that they can't. And I will remind you that, yes, there is absolutely no doubt whatsoever that you can use Control F or Command F on any part of this test in any section, and it is neither a violation nor a concern whatsoever. I could say that 100 times, and there will still be many people who are like, wait, can you use it?
And you have said it. I'm going to get you a bumper sticker.
I'd posted it on my Twitter account, and then I started to see Reddit posts about it. I was like, I don't know what else
more can I do?
Moses comes down from the mountain and is like, come on, seriously?
Get you a face tattoo.
Indeed. Me and Mike Tyson.
I'll Tyson.
Questions about pens and highlighters and things like that. So that stuff always happens. There's always some issues where a proctor, will just disappear. Mm-hmm. And then someone's left sitting there, and then they're calling LSAC trying to work it out. When those things happen, we know that it is devastating. We're not making light of that. What we're trying to point out is that these things always happen at a low level. Did I see widespread, massive problems or phone waits of an hour and a half? No. We saw those maybe on the first or second administration of this, but one of the things that was conveyed to me was that the wait times on this test, in terms of like onboarding as well as calling, were probably the lowest yet.
Yeah.
Which tells me everybody's getting better, everybody's getting more used to it. The goal is always going to be 0 problems. And I know that's what their goal is. I don't know whether it's achievable. It's like having 100% perfect reception on your television. There's always some kind of blip at some point.
Yeah, this test to me posed a particular risk in the sense that it's the first at-home test that we've seen that had a break included. And I was wondering how that would go. But it seems, again, like most of the glitches have been worked out. It seemed like a pretty smooth administration on the whole, and I think that really bodes well for the rest of the year.
You actually make a great point, because I think we weren't the only ones that were concerned about that. LSAC had conveyed to me that they had tried really hard to message people, don't be late.
Yeah.
Because at that 10-minute point, if you haven't kind of like said, I'm ready to go again, and started the recertification process, your test is about to be canceled at that point. Mm-hmm. They just don't let you come back 15 minutes later and say, oh, I missed the first 5 minutes. You're out at that point. So you and I had talked about it before. They had sent emails to people. And at least the last time I had checked on Tuesday, there had not been anybody who had come back, like 15 or 20 minutes later and had been canceled out of the test at that point. They felt like everybody was like coming back early enough where it was working as they had hoped it would.
Yeah, it's interesting you bring that up. I didn't see any of those reports either, where people actually missed their third section somehow by being tardy and ran into the kind of calamity that we knew could potentially come about. So it was good. People were sufficiently chastened, it seemed.
I did see someone post on Reddit in the middle of their test what their first 2 sections were.
Oh, no.
And I was busy at the moment and I didn't have the opportunity to write them what I wanted to write them, which was, no, don't do this. This is the worst possible idea because you are not supposed to use your phone. You're not supposed to be on Reddit during the test. You're supposed to be kind of like in a blackout zone where you're just kind of like using that break to either go to the restroom or get something to eat or drink really quickly, just get up, stretch your legs, what have you. They don't want to see you posting on Facebook or Instagram how your test is going.
Yeah, nor do I understand what potential advantage it might convey to the poster. Like, why would you allow that degree of distraction to creep in and occupy some percentage of your, mental RAM?
This was later on Tuesday, and I was already like tired. I was feeling like a zombie at that point.
Yeah.
And I saw it, and my intention was I need to write something here that says like, "Hey, this is a bad idea." At least DM the person, and then I got distracted.
Don't.
Don't do that.
Yeah, don't do that. Aside from that kind of flagrancy, I didn't see anything that was too worrisome, frankly, and I think that's good news all around for students and for LSAC.
It's a great break to have. I'm really glad that it's there. As long as you follow the rules and come back in and hit the button to kind of keep going and then do the quick recheck in, it's a great thing. As far as having problems around that test, hopefully you're not one of those people who did have any issues. If it was catastrophic, do what we said before. File a complaint, ask for a retake, and then see what they do. They won't give you a retake if your test, zoned out for 5 seconds.
Right.
But if you got to the middle of section 2 and that your test ended and you couldn't complete it, yeah, then you'll be able to get a retake. It's got to be something of significant level to have affected your score and your ability to complete the test.
Yeah, and again, the good news here is we didn't see too many of those catastrophes. So next Thursday should be a low-key day.
I hope so, because once again, we'll have to pay attention on Thursday, and you know how I hate paying attention.
Well, yeah, you'll have to remind me of that drink recipe because I'm getting thirsty.
Drinking it all day.
Yeah, send me another bottle of wine.
So we're about to start the run-up here to discussing what the test content was. Now, one of the things that we want to do is we've kind of taken all of our reminders and disclaimers. I did this after our last podcast because we kept doing it throughout. I said, let's consolidate that section and run through them all prior to actually talking about it. Then we don't have to do any disclaimers after that. And there's a few extra ones that we have here because of the experimental and so forth. So this section is actually kind of important, especially the last point I'm going to make about online summaries of this. So, John, do you want to take it away? Or do you want me to...
I really was hoping you would.
I'm happy. I can do it all, man.
Take it away, Dave.
All right. So the first reminder here is that everything we're going to talk about in terms of the sections and what have you is kind of public knowledge. It's something that has been talked about and debated already online. What we're going to do is kind of organize that information and then add an extra sheen of information that we happen to have and hopefully some kind of like greater expertise and certitude to exactly what we're talking about. So if you look at how this actually works, one of the things to remember, and I saw a lot of confusion about this over the weekend, is remember that the way this kind of online at-home test is presented is that not everybody has identical content. They rotate sections. That is okay. What that means is when they start putting the scalings together, not everybody has the same scale. You get a specific scale for the test content that you had. So if you had a really hard test, that means your scale is going to be easier. And if you had a so-called easier test, your scale is going to be tighter. We'll talk about the hard and easy in just a second as well.
Yeah, those descriptors are going to get their own talking point.
Ah, yes. There's lots of this. But this is an important point to understand, that what is occurring is that you can start off on a Saturday morning and get a particular RC that's really difficult. And then if you take the test, or someone else, a friend of yours, takes the test on Sunday, they might get an entirely different reading comprehension section. And that's okay. You won't get the same scale. They'll get their own scale. You'll get yours. And part of our job here tonight is to actually explain about how all that works.
That's right.
This also means that if the sections are changing throughout the day and the content is being rotated in, the section order is also being changed. Saw numerous examples, as we always do, of people having identical test content in different orders. So when people start saying, oh, my first RC, that is meaningless. You have to be able to say, well, my first RC was about fungi, and that's this one. And so then my other RC was about this other topic. First appearance, second appearance doesn't mean anything. Great examples on this test of some people having RC first and fourth, and then discovering that they were actually talking about sections that were in reverse order. One person had it at first and the other person had it at fourth, and they were confusing each other, in part because of some of the things the test makers did. Tricky, which we'll get to.
Yeah, we saw this first thing Saturday morning, in fact.
Yeah, it was right out of the gate.
It was where we were instant confusion.
Something's going on here, which we figured out, so we're all good.
Yeah.
All right. The next thing is that people often talk about disclosing information, and LSAC has allowed the human condition to exist, which is they know people want to talk. They want to make a few comments about like, hey, that was a hard passage. Does everybody agree? Or those games weren't as bad as I feared they would be. So they let you talk about the basic topics. Here's what they don't allow you to talk about: what the right answer was, what the wrong answers were, what the question type was, what type of game it was. The main point of the fourth paragraph in the reading comp passage. They don't allow you to talk about specifics. And quite honestly, when people do talk about specifics, I'll sometimes say, hey, that's going too far. And the reason is very simple, because I want everyone to be allowed by the test makers to talk about the test in general, because I think it really relieves tension and makes people feel better. And the more specific you get about this answer choice, the worse it is going to be, and they're going to crack down on that. So you can say, hey, I had the LR that had Neanderthals in it and feathers and all this kind of stuff. Just don't start saying that was a parallel reasoning question and the answer was C. That's too far.
Yeah, that's a good point. Part of you and me and others scrutinizing this and policing it to a certain extent is so that we can continue to have a conversation like this. Because if people weren't allowed to talk at all, we couldn't. But if people talk too much, it could actually begin to work against our objectives too. So I had a passage about Don Quixote. Fine. Did anybody else pick D for question 17? Not fine. And we keep a close eye on this, both on our forum and elsewhere. So yeah, and this conversation obviously won't risk treading too far into any of those objectionable territories.
Yeah, we're not going to cross the lines that we're well aware exist.
Right.
And everything, as I said, for the most part, maybe not every little thing, but a lot of this is out there. We've just reorganized it and distilled it. So let's keep on with just a few more points that I think are really helpful. Really a reminder here, when you take the LSAT for real, it almost always feels worse than a practice test. It's just not the same. The pressure, the way you feel about it, the fact that you're going to focus on any little thing that you did incorrectly is going to prejudice how you view the experience. A practice test just doesn't have the same pressure. You can perform the same on the real thing in a practice test, and a lot of times people will say that the practice test was much easier and felt better. It's about this negativity bias that creeps into the actual experience, which changes and colors your perception. So be aware of that. You walk out of that test, most people walk out saying, that was horrible. That's normal. That's not abnormal. So when I first see people starting to talk about that was hard, that was terrible, my reaction isn't like, this is the hardest LSAT ever. My reaction is typically, another LSAT is completed.
Would you say people's tendency is to underestimate their own performance versus perhaps overestimate?
To some extent, although I also believe that people have a good gauge of like, look, this isn't going well. So I think there's degrees of realism. Even when it goes well, though, a lot of people, most I would think, come out and they still don't feel good about it. They could have done very well, but it's just grueling. It's a tough experience. It's mentally draining. You're not supposed to feel good after the LSAT. And so you shouldn't be surprised when you don't.
Yeah, I think that's fair. Most of the people I see walk out of this thing tend to feel, even when they've done well, that it didn't go quite as well as they had hoped, or it didn't quite live up to their own expectations of themselves, despite what the numbers may ultimately represent several weeks later. So
yeah, and you're going to second guess everything that you do.
Exactly.
Hesitated for 10 seconds. Oh, I lost 10 seconds.
I must have missed it. Yeah.
Everything looks bad. That's the negativity bias. Let's go on to the next reminder.
Probably, I don't know if this is the most important point, but I know what
I've already done it.
Yeah, no.
I've already done it, so we might as well make mention of it. And that is this point. When we talk about things being easier or harder, this is all relative to a baseline situation where things are already difficult. We mean easier or harder relative to each other. My personal view of the LSAT is that it is hard, and every one of them is hard. Every one of the sections of logical reasoning has its own challenges and difficulties. We're already in a zone of really high difficulty. So if I say this section was easier, I still mean it was hard. It just wasn't as difficult as another section. So be aware of the fact that the relativity aspect is really important here.
Yeah. Perfect. You got any more? I bet you do. I bet you do.
You're going to make me do all of this, aren't you?
Do you want me to? Yeah, I'll jump in whenever.
No. I'm on it, man.
I've got thoughts, but you're doing great.
I'll carry this one. So the next thing I want to remind people of is that the test makers are actively attempting to confuse you by placing the same topic in multiple sections. They've been doing this for a while. When we do podcast reviews, we started highlighting it. I'm going to highlight it again on occasion tonight, but I will point out that you cannot assume that because someone mentions a topic, for example, Nigeria in reading comprehension, and then someone else mentions also Nigeria, that you had the same section. They are doing this with all the sections and all the topics. And I'm sure their argument would be, oh, this happens naturally as we have experts write about different interesting topics. Sure. But it sure is happening a lot where they're using different sections that have the same topics or crossover topics on the same exam. And that could be music in logic games where there's all of a sudden musical instruments or bands are involved. It's really confusing to talk about that after the test. You're like, oh, the one about music. And the person who had a different one about music is like, oh, that's right. And then confusion results. This is an active thing that I believe that they are doing. And I think it's perfectly fine that they're doing it. This is not criticism. This is just acknowledgement that it exists and that as a test taker, you need to be specific about what you were talking about. It was a Nigerian writer as opposed to just Nigeria. Those are the types of things that are okay to say that allow you to actually make sure you're talking about the right thing. They're going to keep on doing it. I don't think there's a problem with that. That's what I would do if I was in their shoes. So it's a known tactic. Be aware of it. Use that to your advantage in terms of understanding this test, because there's a ton of people out there who don't understand how it works and then they get confused. You want to avoid that.
Yeah, and this is, of course, the subject of much of our difficulties in doing what we're doing here. Someone says they had a LR question on speed limits. Someone else did too. And one was real and one was experimental. And they were different questions on a similar subject. One was about a Nigerian language for, a national thing. Another was about a Nigerian author in a book. One was real, one wasn't. This is where, again, this is why we get paid the big bucks.
Is it the big bucks?
I don't know what it is.
Oh, well, we get paid.
This is why we get to at least drink and have this conversation.
If we're getting paid for drinking, that's pretty big time. Let's continue on. We're almost at the end of this, and then we'll get into the sections. So tonight, for the first time in a while, since really, before the pandemic, we are going to talk about real and experimental sections, and we're going to attempt to differentiate the two. There's certain assumptions that we've made in doing this, especially about reusage. If we know for a fact that a section appeared previously and it was real, we have made the assumption that it is being used as a real section and was not reintroduced as experimental. So that's an important thing to understand because this is part of how we figured this out. We're going to give you the scalings for the experimental sections as well. So even if we happen to be wrong, and I'm virtually certain that we are not about this particular point, you still would be able to calculate out what your scoring would be on this. So we're going to cover ourselves either way, but be aware that some of the assumptions that we've made in here have lent us to feel that this is real, this is not. And there's, in a lot of cases, independent confirmation of that. There were some things that we knew early on from people who had only 3 sections on their test due to accommodations. We're like, these are all scored.
Yeah.
So
can I add a point or two maybe to this?
Yes.
Because I think there's some other assumptions that we're kind of caging our estimates upon. One is that if it's real for one person, it's not going to be experimental for someone else.
Good.
It's true for reusage of past real content. It's true during the week itself. And the second is that they're not mixing and matching real and experimental content piecemeal or part to whole in terms of a section. So half your logical reasoning was real and half wasn't, and someone else might see a different half of theirs. We're, again, operating under the assumption that they've never done that before. That's not an assumption, that's true. But the assumption is they're not going to start now.
That's exactly right. So just keep that in mind, because as we go through this, we're going to try to cover everything that was used this weekend and on Tuesday. And so that's a lot to take in, but you're going to have to separate out what we're talking about from real to experimental as we go through it. I will say that it is possible you might not hear your section mentioned as we go through this. We may have missed something. It can get confusing. There was a reason that I chose Ball of Confusion as the song, because there were times, especially in logical reasoning, where we were like, we're not 100% clear on what we're looking at. We felt like we had it, and so that's a part of the situation. The other is this: we're not going to list every single question that we see in a section. There's some of these sections where I actually think we have all the questions that were in them. But I'm not going to list every single one of them because that would be the most boring podcast in the world, and I'm not looking for that achievement. So you may hear something and think, if they didn't talk about my section, it might be that just the questions we mentioned didn't ring a bell. We tried to pick questions that were pretty popular and would be notable for some particular reason, whether it was topic or what have you. So again, if you didn't hear something and you were like, I thought I had that, don't be concerned about it. That does happen, especially after the pressure of this test. Right. And then the very last point, and then we'll finally get to it. My apologies for this long disclaimer list. I'm going to make a request, and it's very similar to the request we're now making with the Crystal Ball, and there are reasons for this, which I'll just briefly mention. And the request is this: we're going to ask that you do not summarize what we have said in this podcast online. The summaries that I've seen in the past have often missed some of the things that we've said and had inaccurate information, and they most assuredly missed the nuance of what we said. And to be honest, we don't want to have people hear what we have to say through kind of like a subpar summary. We want them to hear what is being said directly. It really frustrated me with the Crystal Ball prior to this, actually a couple back, as well as the last podcast that we did, because I had to go in and ask people to correct posts and put replies on there saying that's not exactly what we said. It was actually this. I don't want to do that again, and I do want to keep on doing this. So we're going to ask that you not summarize it and post it online. And for those of you who comply, which I hope is all of you, thank you in advance.
Yes, I've often said to people, there's really only one person in the world I trust to sufficiently convey my opinions on things. And lucky me, he's here right now. So, hi. And
I didn't know you had a dog. That's
yeah, outside the two of us, I'm not really sure anyone could adequately do justice to how we're going to break this down. At least not in some, forum post or something. So, a fair request, I hope.
I think so. I mean, we're doing it here for free. I want to keep on doing it for free, so please help us to do it that way.
You're not getting paid?
Well, you know what I mean. We're not charging anybody for this. And I don't want to do that ever. So let's get into it then. Let's run down this kind of test administration and go through it. And what we're going to do is we're going to first describe the sections that we saw in largely the order they started coming out. So we're going to mix real and experimental sections, and we're going to mention that. So you're going to hear things. And if you are capable of taking notes on this, what you want to think to yourself is, 3 of your sections were scored. 1 reading comp, 1 logic games, 1 logical reasoning. And then you know that the section that was doubled was experimental. So, for example, right out of the gate, we're going to talk about 2 reading comprehension sections. One of them is going to be real and one of them is going to be experimental. So if you had both of them, you're going to want to focus on the one that was real. And then later on, we will run down a scaling matrix for this entire test. And that is usually where people are able to figure out what we think the scoring scale is going to look like for this exam. John, I'm going to let you start off with the reading comp because I think this was a passage that had some topics that you were very interested in.
Well, at least one of them. I'm still on the fence about photography. But yeah, this is largely chronological. And here's what we woke up to Saturday morning to see. We saw most everyone on Saturday morning was getting an experimental reading comprehension section. So 2 sets of RC passages. Here were the 2 sets, and I'll start with the real section of reading comprehension. Here were these 4. One was about sentence reduction due to prosecutorial misconduct. The one I think Dave is referring to that I am familiar with is a book written by a guy named Lawrence Krauss, cosmologist, a book called Universe from Nothing, which was about quantum physics, basically. That was the comparative passage and largely reported to be the hardest of the 4. There was also a passage about Ansel Adams and this photography movement towards f/64 apertures. I don't know what that is. I have yet to look into it, but some pictorialism context. And then finally, a 4th passage about choosing a national language for Nigeria. A strange quirk of Nigeria is that the national language is still English, when I think we'd all agree that it shouldn't be. So that's what that passage was about. But those were the 4 real passages we saw in reading comp, but they were coupled with a set of reading comp passages that were experimental. These were those 4. There was a passage about a Supreme Court case, the United States versus Winter, which led to Winter's doctrine, which is what this passage was about. It was Native American water regulation law for Native American protected lands. There was a passage in there about Don Quixote, another book I've read. A passage in there about GDP. This was the comparative passage. And then finally, a passage about how galaxies in the expanding universe demonstrate a red light shift on the color spectrum as they're observed because they're moving away from a source. Those were the 4 experimental passages. How does that cover it? Does that do
I thought that was pretty good.
A sufficient job for the 8? All right.
Yes, from the well-read John Denning.
Well, I mean, of the 8, I've read 2 books, so I'm not...
And I'll make a comment right out of the gate. The real passages here, the real section, the one with Ansel Adams, who, by the way, is an excellent photographer. I don't know why you're downing.
I'm not. I just know less about him than Lawrence Krauss. That's all. I have a preference, Dave. I'm a human.
And everybody who talked about that Lawrence Krauss passage called it quantum physics. This was a brutal section.
Yeah.
I don't think this is going to go down as a happy section for most people. It is going to loosen the scale, by the way. Mm-hmm. So something to be aware of as we move forward. When we get to the scaling matrix, you can breathe a sigh of relief because if you suffered your way through that and you were able to fight through it, you're going to get the reward of a loosened scale, and perhaps a loosened scale in a way that's a little bit different than we typically have. Perhaps even a little bit more than usual. So we'll come back to that point a little bit later. But those 2 were the reading comps that we saw coming out. And then we saw a couple of sections here that added into that test. And the first one was a logic game section. That is a real section. And it had employees managing staff projects. They had political parties and candidates speaking in a particular order. Mm-hmm. There were movie premieres over several months at theaters, and then fencing matches. 6 people engaged in a various number of fencing matches, as I recall. Mm-hmm. This section was real. All right, so this was part of the scored test. A lot of people figured that out immediately because it was the only logic games they had on their test.
Right.
This section is not going to be classified as difficult. Again, all logic game sections are hard, so we're already in the hard scaling. But on that level of being hard, it's not on the difficult side. This is going to be on the easier side. At best, this is not going to move your scale. At worst, I'm a little worried that it might tighten it at the top line in the kind of like that upper 170s level. So again, we'll come back to that. But this was on the relatively easier side of what is always difficult in terms of logic games. And if you disagree with me, I am sorry and I respect your opinion. So don't be mad at me. I'm just delivering the message. Don't kill the messenger. Then we had a logical reasoning section that a lot of people were able to figure out was real as well.
Right.
And that involved some questions, especially the one about gutta percha, that I think was, for a lot of people, an unusual question. Very interesting the way that particular problem set up, as well as things like A20 helping with asthma, dairy farms, something about video games and playing it for a certain number of hours a day. A pianist involved in fraud. There were monkeys in here. Saw monkeys a few times over the weekend, as well as a question about perforated stamps. So that was a real logical reasoning section. I don't know that it certainly wasn't an easy section. I don't know how hard it was specifically. Ultimately, one of the things we're going to see in logical reasoning is we don't think that any of the logical reasoning is going to move the scale. So we do always say this. If you feel like, hey, I know a lot about this test, I've done a lot of logical reasoning, and this was super difficult, first off, account for that bias of taking the real test and how that makes everything harder than anything else that you've done with this test. So account for that. And if you still feel like, hey, that's going to loosen the scale, trust yourself. We're okay with that. We want you to feel comfortable with how you kind of like ultimately arrive at the scaling number that we have. And again, that's still coming. So
2 quick things from me with this. Number one, that monkeys question, just to elaborate, because there were a few monkey questions over the various sections that appeared. This was about the tamarin monkeys learning or understanding language. I think it had something to do with like tokens or rewards and prefixes and suffixes. That's the monkey question that Dave's referring to. And with the scaling, defer to your own judgment. This is, without a doubt, I think the hardest thing for us to estimate from a distance, how logical reasoning is going to play a role in the ultimate scaling of this. We can do a pretty good job with reading comp in games. LR is tougher. So again, use your own experience, use your own instincts and intuitions when it comes to that.
That's a really good comment because, there's a statistical thing called confidence intervals. And honestly, our confidence in games and reading comprehension and our assessment there is exceptionally high. I still feel pretty solid about all the logical reasoning. One of the problems that we can't see into these problems is the nuance where a question turns from like pretty hard into super difficult is often turns on just a few words and interpretation of a phrase.
Or a single difficult answer choice.
Yeah, that's much harder for us to discern even when we know a lot. Like I could probably tell you almost anything you want to know about gutta percha. Don't ask me because I won't. But I know a lot about that question. But even so, figuring the ultimate difficulty on that comes down to little things that are harder for us to see. We had a couple other logical reasoning sections that rolled through around this time as well. John, I'll let you cover those.
Sure. Yeah, there was another real logical reasoning section that we started seeing fairly early Saturday, although it became more predominant as the day went on and certainly as the weekend progressed. And this was a section that contained questions about billboards. There's a question about star clusters, about dinosaur tracks, I believe parallel tracks like on a beach. A question in there about health drinks. That was a separate section. Those questions were real. There was also some experimental LR that we began to see through Saturday. And just to touch on a couple of those, the question that stood out to me the most, and probably the most mentioned, was about roasted chicken. I really want to read this question because people were talking about it. There was a question also in this section about tyranny. That was a section of logical reasoning that did not count. And it was, again, on Saturday, but it was used throughout the rest of the week.
Yeah. And so we kept moving into Saturday afternoon, and what happens? We start to see another reading comprehension section come in, and this is a real section. And this also featured Nigeria. And so as you saw the morning into the afternoon, people were like, oh yeah, I had that one about Nigeria. No, you didn't. So this was about Achebe's novel, Things Fall Apart. and talking about the Igbo language and tradition in Europe and so forth. So that was one of the passages. Another one about EMF litigation. I'm not talking about the old Britpop band from years and years ago, but this is about who's responsible for property value loss, homeowners, electric company, and so forth.
I didn't even know that was a band. But yeah, this is about electric and magnetic fields.
They only had one hit. They were one hit wonder. Do you know what the song was?
I don't even know the band was, Dave. So no, I
You've
don't
heard
know
the
their
song,
hit.
though.
Have
It was
I?
unbelievable.
Oh, I know that song.
See?
It's unbelievable that I know that song.
That's EMF.
I think we've
ago.
got next week's tune.
I've never seen them live. I have no interest whatsoever.
That's a great
the video
song.
was
I love that
like
song.
12 people on the stage acting ridiculous in like white
Fantastic.
shorts and t-shirts.
I don't know what I'm drinking next week, but I know what we're listening to.
There's another passage about the privatization of public works projects. Should it be public or private, like highways and so forth? That was the comparative passage. A lot of people felt that was a difficult one. And then there was fungi spores on trees and endophytes and protecting trees from damage. So this was an interesting passage because, John, for you and I, there was a moment of vindication. One of the things we talked about in the Crystal Ball was that, you know, we felt like there was a chance that they would use the January 2019 LSAT again. They did not. Do I feel bad about that? I wish I'd been right, but I'm okay with it. I still think that means that it's coming up, you know, sometime soon. The funny thing about it is that when you and I saw this, we started laughing because we're like, technically we were right.
Yeah, and this gets us off the hook, right?
This gets us off the hook, but this is one of those cases where being technically right is still not right. So I'm not taking any credit for this.
That's fair.
This section and these passages were originally on the January 2019 LSAT. So we were correct.
Yes.
They were on the experimental, though.
Yeah.
So technically right, but no, it doesn't count. I'm not.
They did use that test as a source for real content here. They just used the experimental section from the January 2019 LSAT, and that's okay. What I thought was equally, if not more interesting, possibly less redeeming, was where this has been used previously as real.
Yeah, this is the important part.
Mm-hmm.
So they'd had it as an experimental set of sections back in January 2019, but they actually used it for real as a scored section on the October 2020 LSAT Flex, specifically on Tuesday of that test day.
Yeah.
So when we saw this passage, we were like, well, they've used this a couple of times, but stop for a moment right there. It is August of 2021. This section was used in 2020 in October, less than 1 year ago.
Yeah, this is 10 months old, and I'm glad you're leaning into this because this is important.
This is explaining why you're seeing the experimental section. The testing cycle that they are using here has gotten very short on the reusages. Now, look, the way it's set up is they know which sections you've seen in the past, so they don't want to show you that. So if you took the October 2020 LSAT, you should not have seen any of this. And I didn't have any reports of anyone's like, I saw this before.
Me neither.
So they can set it up like this. But to do that is, it's a game that nobody really wants to play because it's easy to make a mistake on this. But this is why the experimental section came back. They are running out of content. Now they've just tested a bunch more content and they can start to expand the field again of tests to pull from. That will make it going forward harder for us to predict which tests might be used. And I said this in our crystal ball that one of the reasons we were able to predict the test a couple months ago and get it right is because the number of candidates for them to use is getting really narrow. That's going to go the other direction now. And quite honestly, the pressure to get it right is not something I honestly enjoy because there is a very much of a dartboard aspect to what comes down with some of this.
Yeah, the stakes are kind of skewed. If we get it right, we look great. If we get it wrong, we look stupid. And it's kind of an imbalanced risk-reward, frankly. I will say, though, the fact that they turned around October 2020 this quickly, and despite the fact that they avoid duplication for people who took that test in 10 months to reuse it, it's very telling, as you suggest. And you and I had a conversation Saturday afternoon when we saw this new reading comp pop up from October 2020. And what you and I both said is, I know what games are coming tomorrow morning. And sure enough, Sunday morning, we woke up to October 2020 games.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that John and I should not be having a private conversation on Saturday afternoon where we can kind of figure out what's next.
Yeah.
I don't like that. I mean, I like it, but I also don't like it. It's not something that I think is the way it should be. It should be completely open. I should have no idea what's coming next. And so I understand. I sympathize. They had over a year's worth of tests and experimentals vaporized by this, and that happened at exactly the same time they had amped up the test schedule to move from 4 tests to, say, 8, 9 tests at a time. That was a bad perfect storm for them, and so that put the squeeze on them. And I've talked about this repeatedly in past Crystal Balls, how that benefited us and allowed us to make predictions over the last several years where we got it right. Hopefully that'll get harder for us going forward. But indeed, on Sunday morning, the logic games that came out was a section from October 2020. These were real. This is an interesting section because we've talked about it in the past. We talked about it in October 2020. And this is a section where the first 3 games aren't terrible. And then the 4th is just a tough all-around game. And the theory on this section is that you're going to be able to build up time in the first 3 games, and then you're going to lose that time in the 4th game and end up as a fair wash. But that game section from October 2020 on Sunday morning has these topics. There's summer camp activities, things like hiking, painting, skiing, volleyball, some other stuff. There's musicians. Whoops, there's musicians. Okay. At different concert halls and performers auditioning. Then there is a game that a lot of people called clay tablets, about ancient artifact ages and the kind of how the age worked out. Mm-hmm. And then the last game in this section, which for a lot of people was the hardest by far, was about kind of like fashion brands, magazines, boutiques, kind of like different stores and these magazines all kind of working together. It gets described in a lot of different ways.
Yeah.
This was the toughest game by far. The hope for you as a test taker is that you have a little extra time, that you don't arrive there with just 8 minutes left, that you've got 10 minutes or 11 minutes or whatever the case might be. And you have to not panic when you reach that particular point. So That was a real section. So if you had that fashion brand, boutique, magazines game, real for you. Clay tablets in the same section, real for you.
Yeah, another section right out of October 2020. Like I said, you and I could see it coming, and we kept that to ourselves on Saturday afternoon. But it began to show, obviously, a trend towards the use of the rest of that test. We'd seen a beginning of it with reading comp on Saturday. Sunday continued it with logic games. There was another set of games that we saw on Sunday morning that was experimental. Let me run through those 4 very quickly. This was a section about bands in 2 spots on a bandstand. There was one about a house being renovated. It was about features to renovate garage and roof and various things. There was one about a reporter, or 8 reporters, I think, interviewing candidates. And then, without a doubt, the hardest game in this section, arguably of this week, security guards assigned to building shifts, 2 different buildings over about 4 days. That game really wrecked a lot of people. Happily, it didn't count.
Yeah, that was an experimental game section. It looks like they have tested out one of the games previously. Mm-hmm. That's floating around out there, maybe back in September of 2019. And they had tested at least one of the games, maybe 2 of these games as experimentals. It looks like they're still trying to get that section dialed in. And when you have a game as tough as security guards, sometimes it takes a little bit more work to kind of like make sure that it is a valid high integrity section.
Yeah, I expect that game to at some point feature as a real thing, but it could be adjusted or amended from the current version because the current version was a real killer.
It's interesting because I had an experience where I took one LSAT and there was an experimental logic game section on the test that I took, and they went through a particular kind of like scenario, and then about 5 or 6 years later, that game appeared on a real test, mm-hmm. and they had changed it. I remembered all the rules from that game, and I was reading, I was like, this is the kind of the same game.
Yeah.
But they'd fooled around with it. So they do actually do that. Sometimes what happens is they put out an experimental section and they discover that the results of it either are not conforming to what they expected or that there's actually a problem. And so they adjust it. Again, that's normal test making, nothing conspiracy theorist or dark there.
There's nothing nefarious about that. It's literally the point of the section itself. Having an experimental allows that particular move.
All right, we're almost at the end here of the sections, which is really interesting because that might tell you that there weren't that many sections overall that were floating around out there. So as we kind of got to the end or middle of Sunday to the end, we saw another experimental section, another real section of logical reasoning. And this is interesting, John. I know you'll have comments about this because we'd been debating how long it would take them to use some of the October 2020 LR. Didn't take long.
We'd already seen reading comp the day before. We saw games that morning. It was almost inevitable, in our opinion, that logical reasoning from that test would make an appearance. And sure enough, here we go.
It did. And this section had 26 questions. It had dark feathered bird bones and Neanderthals. Had shin splints. That doesn't sound like fun. Had something about sand vipers and another about conspiracy theories, books and binding. A question about lawyers arguing about a duly elected council person. So we knew that there was a good chance this was actually going to appear. I think our bigger question was, why didn't the other section appear?
I have a theory. Would you like to hear it? All right. So here's what we know for sure. LSAC is going to release a test at some point in the coming weeks or months. They haven't really specified the timeline, but we know soon we're going to get an official copy of a real practice test that has been administered in the last year. And this is coming. I think that they have reused October 2020 so quickly because that is the test that they're going to release. And I also think that's the reason they only used one of the logical reasoning sections from it, because that is the section that will be included with the test form that they release. This is entirely speculative. I stand alone.
You don't.
On this particular pedestal. Oh, I have company.
First off, full credit to you. This was your theory. You know, and when I heard it, I was like, nice. This is the kind of high-level insight that, I'll be entirely honest, not many people would be able to have. So super congrats to you on that. I was very impressed, and the logic of it hit home. You and I have had a few moments in the past when we've been predicting things where we're like, the logic of that is impenetrably good.
Yeah.
This feels exactly like that. So I think we'll see a test here over the next month or two that is released by them. I feel like you're probably right, John. It's October 2020.
This seems like the forerunner in terms of contenders. But I mean, again, just because it seems that way doesn't necessarily mean LSAC's going to follow the logic behind our reasoning. I also appreciate that you're giving me this much. You should hear my theories on the moon landing. I've got some deep, deep thoughts.
As long as you don't start talking about Kyrie's flat Earth theory.
An after hours podcast discussion.
Yeah, tell me about it. Couldn't believe that. I was like, that guy went to Duke. Get me out of here. One more section to cover, but it was an experimental section. It was a reading comprehension section. So if you had the passage topics of cowbirds, Inca beads, kind of Inca knots, passage about mandatory disclosure, and then one that I really am interested in reading because I couldn't get a good feel for this in the details, but kind of about restaurant ratings and maybe something to do with like food standards, maybe even Los Angeles and highbrow, lowbrow. That sounds totally up my alley after having lived in LA for a while.
Right.
I'd really like to read that. So that was an experimental section. We hadn't seen any of those passages before. And quite honestly, something like cowbirds, if it had been out there, we would have found it. But I went through our archives all the way back to like 2003 or 4 and didn't find anything.
And that's what you would expect from an experimental section, is they should be testing new things. If we start to see repeats in experimentals, it's a little curious. So cowbirds, Inca beads, that section was experimental. It'll come up again somewhere down the line, but for now it didn't count.
Yeah, and a very reasonable section overall.
Yeah.
The responses that we were seeing to that and the feedback we got did not indicate that it was at a high level of difficulty, nor super easy. So right in the middle there, and we'll factor that in. And what that does is that concludes kind of like the review of the sections. As I said before, if you didn't hear a section that you felt that you have, might have been that we described it differently, might have been that we didn't describe all the questions. Suppose it's possible that we missed one. I'm not going to rule that out, especially with LR, but I feel like the reading comp and the logic games, we definitely had nailed. So Again, I count that as a success, John, because I honestly thought on Friday, nah, I'm going to be posting tweets over the weekend that say, guys, losing our grip. We can't tell. But I see that what they did here with this test was they reduced the number of scored sections that they used, and they did that because they had these experimental sections floating around.
That's right. So I'd like to think they did it for our benefit, that they had us in mind, as they said, let's only use 2 real LR, or 2 real reading comps, 2 real games. I think we just got lucky. You and I were both hopeless in a way going into this, or at least my expectation was like, we're doomed.
I think, John, if they were doing it for us, there would have been 50 sections of each type. Okay,
it would have felt malicious.
For us, they would have been like, "Oh, you guys go straight to hell."
You're absolutely right.
Because of the additional section and the different orders, I think they felt that the obscurity factor was already pretty high. And so they used far fewer real sections than they typically do. And I was actually fine with that. I felt like it allowed us to be on top of it, but it was still confusing enough that watching students dialogue and talk about this showed me that they were struggling at times. And I saw some people figuring things out later on in the days, and especially towards the end of the weekend. But sometimes it's hard, if you're early in the day and taking this, to know what it was. And there was a lot of people who were like, please tell me what's real and what's not. And I had to tell them, I cannot. Have agreed to wait until later in the week. But this is the moment. And so we have covered all of that, I think, as best as we possibly could. And I think we felt like we had pretty good control over it, which was a huge victory, because I didn't think we'd be doing this.
I didn't either.
It was going to be really short, and I was going to be like, well, we tried. That section was hard for sure. We don't know if it was real or not, but that's not what happened. So let's break it down.
Yeah, you make 2 interesting points there. One is we were able to track it, which was great. The second is I didn't feel, watching people say on Tuesday, who were seeing some of the content that people had seen Saturday morning, I didn't get any kind of impression that the reuse of that, or even the degree of predictability in that, gave them any kind of advantage. I don't think people waiting later in the week to test were naturally, beneficiaries of this type of reuse.
Yeah.
Which is good. That's exactly what you would hope to hear about a test that's meant to stay fair.
Yeah, I'll make one other point too about the sections that we talked about. There are always a few sections that are out there that weren't given to many people. Those are the ones that are easy to miss. So you might have fallen into that grouping as well. So if we don't talk about your section, as we're about to kind of like recap this in short order, that would probably be the reason. And you'll just have to use your best judgment on it. So let's break down the matrix of how this actually works and kind of talk about what the whole kind of setup is. As I said before, LSATs get their own scale. So depending upon which reading comp, logical reasoning, and logic games that you get, you're going to have a particular scale that goes along with that. The scale does not take into account section order, which, trust me, I agree 1,000% that section order has an impact here and can really be devastating, or on the other side, beneficial, or sometimes totally neutral. You don't like reading comp and you get 2 reading comps right out of the gate, that's bad news. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I was going to say, it also doesn't take into account the experimental section type. If I got reading comp experimental, it would be a worse day than if I got logic games experimental.
Exactly. And so there are elements in these scales that they don't account for that. But what the scaling does is, remember, it deals with difficulty. If you have a really hard LSAT on a logical standpoint, they loosen the scale so they can produce normalized results. And then they reverse that. If your test is relatively easier, then they tighten the scale in order to produce that kind of bell curve of results that they expect to see. This is what the experimental does. It allows them to pretest all of these items and not only figure out that they're valid, but also how students will perform. And so, by and large, before you sit down, they know how you're going to do as a group. They don't know how you are going to do, but they know how the collective will do.
Right.
So when we go through this, we're going to talk about each section type, first logic games, then reading comprehension, then logical reasoning. We know from a scaling standpoint that the way this works is we start with a baseline of you can miss 7 questions to get a 170 on a typical kind of like setup here. So what we're talking about is a scaling based upon 7. That means if we scale it out and it loosens to 8, then you could miss 8 questions to get a 170. If we scale it out further and it goes to 9, well, then you can miss 9 questions to get a 170. That does trickle down somewhat, but not perfectly. So it doesn't automatically mean you can count down to 160 and 150 from there. Scales are like accordions. They tend to compress and expand as you go through them. So just keep that in mind. Won't deal with anything involving section order. We're just interested in you identifying your real sections. Now, as I mentioned before, we're also going to throw in the experimental sections so that if you did have that experimental, you could see, would that have changed anything if it was real? If we were somehow wrong, even though I don't think we are, you'll now know, okay, it was either this or this. You'll have that range mentally. This way, I think everybody's covered and we cannot be criticized.
Well, you're wrong about that. We will be. But we should not be criticized. What I think the experimental discussion does is give some degree of like relative context. So for instance, if you had 2 sets of games, knowing that your experimental was objectively harder, at least in our opinion, than your real ones, gives you some sense of how to ultimately weight the things that matter. So that's why we're going to include the discussion of experimental.
Okay, so I'm going to do the logic games, and I'm going to turn the reading comp over to Jon.
Oh boy, I get to really do some book reviews. Before I do though, one more thing. We're going to be conservative. We're always conservative. We always lean to the side of tighter as opposed to looser, despite the fact, and Dave's concerns of criticism, that it would be easier for us to give you happier news. Ultimately, we tend to dwell towards the tighter scales with these. So if we say -8, it might be -9, but it's probably not -7.
Yeah, and that is because if you're going to make a mistake on estimation and someone's calculating their score, you want to have them make it so that their score would turn out better than expected, not worse than expected.
Yeah.
So that is why we do that. That is a calculated decision. We're always clear about that.
Yeah, this is us undercharging you, basically.
Okay.
No, that holds. All right. Wrap your head around it while you talk about games.
Starting at -7, find your real logic games section. If you had the section about staff projects, political parties, film premieres, and fencing, it is not going to change your section at all. In fact, this section worries me because I can see a world in which at the really high level, this tightens the scale.
Me too.
But we're going to leave it at 0 effect at 170. 175, I don't know. This section didn't help you. This was the easiest, relatively speaking, of the 3 sections over the weekend. The other real section was the one about camp activities, auditions for musicians, clay tablets, and then that fashion brand magazine boutique one. This is a section that's really in the middle. When we talked about this before during the October 2020 LSAT review, we talked about the idea that it's really between 0 and 1, which was an idea that we developed into kind of what we call the 0.5, meaning at the 170 level, it doesn't change your scale. So you'd still be at 7 with this. At 160, though, it does kind of loosen the scale. That accordion effect downstream would move the 160 level and ultimately to 150 and give an extra question in that range. Those were the real sections there. So essentially not going to change 170 for anybody, but you can see how there's some nuance at 175 or 160 depending upon the sections. Experimental section that was out there, just in case you're interested, if you had that security guard section, yes, that would move your scale if it turned out to be real. It's not real, but if it were, it would move it and loosen it from 7 to 8. But if you had 2 experimentals, or I'm sorry, 2 logic games section, you should be looking at this one saying, yeah, I felt that security guards section was worse. That is the consensus. Doesn't mean that every single person in the world would agree, but by and large they would. So you're going to mostly be at -7 to get a 170. You can miss 7 questions there after logic games. Now, I'm going to turn it over to Jon for the most interesting exposition of reading comprehension.
Let me tell you about Lawrence Krauss. What's interesting here to me is the experimental games were easily, I think, the hardest thing that people encountered for that section type over the week. The real reading comp, I think, was the hardest stuff, which again, I know is terrible news for some people listening to this, but here we are. So the section we saw first as being real in reading comprehension was about prosecutorial misconduct and sentencing, Lawrence Krauss, A Universe from Nothing, Ansel Adams, the photography, and then the Nigerian thing. This was hard. And Dave and I have actually gone back and forth debating this a little bit, much like we did the camp activities and clay tablets game section, because to me, this lives in between a whole number point scaling. This is going to loosen it by at least 1. I don't think it goes all the way to loosening it by 2, despite being very difficult. I might put this at like 1.5. And Dave, I think you'd agree that that's our consensus, a fair assessment.
Yeah, we talked about it for quite a long time.
We have actually gone back
as to how it works. And the 1.5 is interesting because usually you say, well, that is going to loosen it down towards the 160. But you have a really interesting theory on this. You want to expand on that?
I sure do. My first theory is everyone should go read that Lawrence Krauss book. It's really good. My second theory is that I think reading comprehension and games actually hit people differently with their difficulty. People in the higher ranges tend to be less affected by harder games, is my suspicion, whereas reading comprehension tends to actually penalize everyone at the higher levels when it's that difficult. So I think when you start to look down even through the high 160s, you're going to see much more of an impact from this difficult RC section than you would have from a Duff Games, and certainly into the 170s. So that's my, again, suspicion. I think if you get into the 164, 166, 68, I think this is probably going to have more of an impact than it might at the 155 or 150 kind of range.
The super difficulty of reading comprehension affects people with really high scores because every question counts.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas you might say that somebody scoring 145, they're going to struggle with a lot of that section and that, those passages because it's just brutal anyway.
Yeah.
And so this is almost reverse of what we were talking about with the 0.5 on logic games. And it's really an acknowledgement that that section is a rough one.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you're looking at it, and it's tough to parse exactly what we're saying, we understand that. It's actually hard to explain, I think. But that was the toughest section of the entire week. And there is kind of like a benefit for that, probably seen most in the upper registers of the scaling.
Yeah, I think that's where you get the most forgiveness, as it were, from having to face something that difficult. But a lot of people did face it. It was still used, well, we're recording this on Wednesday. It was used yesterday through Tuesday as well. So people have continued to struggle through this section. If you saw it, I think it's probably going to loosen your scale by at least 1, possibly 2, depending on, again, on where you are. Let's talk about the other real reading comp, which we, again, saw Saturday morning straight away. Mostly Saturday afternoon, though, and this was the one about Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart. EMFs was in this section, the publicization versus privatization of public works, highways, and fungi spores acting as endophytes to protect their tree hosts. This was a slightly easier section, although admittedly quite difficult, and we talked about this when it was first used last October 2020 as real, first used as experimental in the test we predicted, January 19. I think this probably loosens it by 1. In fact, this is arguably the most confident I feel about any of the reading comp. I think this is a perfect 1 loosener for the scale at 170. Again, Dave, I'll confer with you, although we've talked privately.
You don't need to. We're already, this came out in October 2020. We'd agreed before. We agree again. So I feel comfortable with this guy.
I love consistency. Let's talk about the 2 other reading comp sections that we've seen people have this week, both of which were experimental. So if you saw one of these, you can discount it in terms of its impact on your ultimate results. One that we saw Saturday morning, again, sections 1 and 4 are where these 2 reading comp sections tended to appear. This was Winner's Doctrine, the case with water regulations. Don Quixote was in this section, red light shifts of expanding galaxies, etc. I don't think this would have done anything had it counted. This felt like a very middle-of-the-road medium section. The other experiment... Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
And either way, it didn't count, so you're all good no matter how you felt about it.
Yeah, this could have loosened the scale by 5. It wouldn't have mattered. And the other reading comp, experimental, which we saw first on Sunday, and again used through Tuesday, was about cowbirds, the Inca knots and beads, mandatory disclosures, and ratings. And again, another medium section. I thought it was very fair. It's interesting to me that the 2 of the 4 easier sections for reading comp didn't count. But that's not the worst thing in the world, and I've had to explain this to a few people. it's not the end of the world to see something easier not count against you, because frankly, when the scale loosens, it is to your benefit if you can perform at a level that's better than the scale suggests it expects of you.
There's a second reason that it's not so bad either, although less for the people who took this test, but more for future test takers. You want to see a bunch of reasonable experimental sections, because in the future, that means we're going to see reasonable sections again.
Yeah.
At some point, we're going to run into the security guard's logic game, and everyone's going to be unhappy.
All right.
With this kind of reading comprehension, reading comp has been so brutal over the last couple of years, in just consistently the toughest section as you go through it. To see two sections that felt, again, not easy, but not insanely difficult was actually really kind of like a relief.
Well, yeah, a relief potentially for people in the future. A lot of August people are listening to this and like, relief for who? Not for me.
Yeah.
But
well, for me personally, it's like, gosh, I don't have to deal with like the toughest reading comp in the world over and over.
In some degree of perpetuity, I think for the future generations who encounter Winter's Doctrine or Cowbirds, they'll be glad to see those, because they're not going to be quite so punishing as, well, good old Lawrence Krauss.
All right. So again, looking at the real sections, you're getting loosened no matter which one you had there by at least one. And that brings us to logical reasoning. And the easiest way for me to do this is to say that they all had the same exact effect, which was none. So it doesn't matter whether you had the one about, A20 and the gutta percha, or the billboard star clusters and the parallel dinosaur tracks, or the ones about the cast iron pots and the shin splints and the feathers. Those sections, all of which we know were real, they all had a 0 impact on the 170 scaling and how many questions you could miss. And the other section, that we talked about being experimental, about the roasted chicken and anything else that might be out there that perhaps we didn't catch, that's also going to be 0. I didn't hear anything that suggested to me that what I was seeing was out of line with kind of like baseline normal LR. So it really, the difficulty adjustment in here is all in logic games and reading comprehension. Looks like LR was pretty standard and normalized, no matter whether it was real or experimental. So that makes it easy to kind of like close it out that way. And that ends up in a situation where most of these tests are going to be about 8 to kind of get a 170 here, 8 questions that you could miss. There's configurations in here, John, where, especially with that prosecutorial misconduct quantum physics section where we are talking about, that might very well be kind of like a -9 scenario there.
My suspicion is, and again, I wish this was the test that I suspected they would release, because then we could confirm my suspicion or disprove it. But I think if you had a combination of the quantum physics, the Ansel Adams photography, and the clay tablets games, I think that probably does take you to -9, regardless of your logical reasoning.
Yeah, and that's a really good point, because if you had the staff projects and fencing film premieres and you paired it with this quantum physics one, then I'd say that's -8.
100%.
So this is the nuance we were talking about. I don't want someone saying, well, Dave said it's -9. I said that could take you to -9 if you have the right logic games, being the clay tablets fashion brands. If you have the other logic games about film premieres, then it's going to stay at -8. And this is why it is so tough, I think, for people to summarize what we're saying, is because we're talking a mile a minute, and for like an hour plus, it's not going to be easy to say this is it, plus this, minus this. It is more nuanced than this. And especially this situation with this particular test is more nuanced. So that summarizes the full scale matrix. And obviously, one of the things we always say is if you have questions about the predictions that we've made, feel free to ask us, whether it's on Reddit or our LSAT forum at PowerScore, or whether you want to hit John or I on Twitter and ask us a question about it. We're always happy to try to like explain in more detail to an extent. Obviously, we can't disclose some of the information. And some of the stuff that we know is public and has been talked about. Some of it's because they've administered these tests before and we have a database on it, and that does make a difference. And we will not disclose that database information to anyone. So got asked about that a lot last time. Hey, can you No, I cannot show it to you.
I've been asked that since Sunday. Can you tell me the rest of the questions from October 2020? And in my head, I'm like, I can, but I won't.
Well, yeah, I can, but it won't be happening. You got to have some fun with the LSAT. Sometimes John and I are so tired, it's like we're punch drunk. Soon, hopefully drunk, but that's a whole different situation. Last things here, the score release on this, once again, Friday, September 10th, 9 a.m. Eastern Time. Be ready for it. Usually comes out very quickly, all within about 10 minutes or so. And I think for at least my standpoint, that's pretty much it. Let's look to see if John's right about October 2020 being the release test. I feel strongly that he is.
No pressure.
Another feather in your cap, John. You get it.
I need it. This cap felt really featherless.
Feels like a 1780s kind of phrase that I just turned there.
It is, right?
George Washington style.
Some sort of.
Any last comments?
No. I will say I was relieved that we were able to get away with this in a way that we weren't certain we would be, and largely that was due to the fact that it was a much narrower selection of content that we saw, and I think that's the right decision. So LSAC, if you're listening to this, keep it up. You did the right thing here. You didn't need to overdo it with test option upon option. This was exactly the right way to administer this, and I was very pleased with how the week played out.
Yeah, it was still confusing. I will make two final comments and then close it down. The first is this. We will do a crystal ball for the October LSAT. So you can sign up for that at powerscore.com/free seminars. Just like all the recent ones, it'll be free to the public, but it's one night only. So Cleveland, show up, have fun with it. And the other thing is once again, the next time we do a podcast recap of this, it's all predicated on the idea that we're able to follow through the experimentals and identify them. It can be tough. So this time it went well for us. We felt good. Hopefully that continues on next time. So on that presumption, we'll not only do a crystal ball, and we hope to see you there for that, but we'll also then do a recap of that October LSAT thereafter.
Yeah, crystal ball September 12th, actually. It's already on the calendar, so you can go sign up for it. If you took this test, you'll have your score 2 days before we talk about the next one. So we hope you join us.
It's on the 12th?
Yeah.
Isn't that like a Sunday?
If we did the last one on a Sunday.
I didn't want to do it on a Sunday again.
We're clearly lunatics. We're masochists and have not learned our lesson.
Nah, man, we screwed that up. It should be on Sunday night. I'm mad at myself.
Too late. It's not too late to change it.
Why did I agree to that?
I don't know.
Last time I complained mightily about it being on Sunday.
I remember you did. This sucks. But the next one is Sunday.
If you get a chance, please subscribe to this podcast on iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, or anywhere else you may find it in the world. And if you've enjoyed it, leave us a comment or a rating. We are going to do a mailbag episode for our next podcast. So please send any questions that you have to lsatpodcast@powerscore.com, or you can post them on our forum or post them to John and I on Twitter. We would be happy to answer those for you, and we'd love to see those questions come in. So hopefully the August test went well for you. Hopefully this was helpful. We appreciate you listening. On behalf of John and myself, have a great week. Take care of yourself.